This is a dissection of the sheep heart. Looking at the sheep heart, we can distinguish the front from the back by looking at this anterior interventricular sulcus or interventricular groove. Notice that it comes at an angle across the front. And there's blood vessels that lie in here, and they're covered by this layer of fat. But you can definitely see this diagonal line coming across the front of the heart, which is the anterior interventricular sulcus. And this also divides our ventricles. So this would be the right ventricle here, and this is the left ventricle here. These are the muscular receiving chambers of the heart. At the bottom of the heart, this pointed region, this is the apex. So this is part of the left ventricle. We can see that that is on the bottom aspect of this anterior interventricular sulcus. So that is the apex. And at the top, this whole wide region, it's almost like an upside down triangle, this is what we refer to as the base. So this whole distance here is the base. So you can distinguish the front from the back of the sheep heart by looking for that angular anterior interventricular sulcus. Lies between the ventricles. That's where it gets its name, interventricular. If we turn it and look at the posterior side, there's another interventricular sulcus, but you'll see that it runs vertically. And this is the posterior. This is not in your lab objectives. You don't need to know that, but it's good for distinguishing front and back. If it's vertical, then you know you're on the back side of the heart. So this is the front side or anterior aspect of our heart. So these are the large muscular ventricles that are the pumping chambers of the heart. They pump blood away from the heart. So they pump blood away, the ventricle muscular chambers. I think I said they were receiving chambers. That's incorrect. They are the pumping chambers. They pump blood away from the heart. If we look at the top, we see these flap-like structures here. These are the atria. These are the receiving chambers of the heart. They're much smaller than the ventricles here. They are small flap-like structures on the top surface of the heart, and they receive blood into the heart. Therefore, we'll always find veins leading to the atria because veins carry blood back to the heart, and that blood is received by the left and right atrium. So this is the right atrium, this is the left atrium. And these scalloped edges here on the edges of the atria are little areas for blood to fill. We call those auricles. So here I can see an auricle, this scalloped edge here on the left atrium. So those are the atria. These are the ventricles. We have the apex, we have the base, and then if we look at the surface of the heart, we'll also find some major vessels. The major vessel that carries blood away from the right ventricle is the pulmonary artery, and that's what we can see here. It's the most easily seen vessel on the front side of the heart. So I can see the pulmonary artery here. I can put my finger in it, and if I push my finger into it, I can see that it leads to the right ventricle. So that's the pulmonary trunk is the base, and then it would branch left and right to the lungs. We lost a little bit of light here. Sorry about that. We have a motion detected light in this lab room. So this is the pulmonary artery. And then if I look just behind that, I'm going to find a very large vessel, similar in structure as far as the walls, much thicker and muscular. This is the aorta. This is the largest vessel in the heart. It lies just behind the pulmonary artery in the sheep heart. You can push your finger in that, and if you push your finger down, you'll notice it directs your finger left, and you would be here in the left ventricle. So the aorta carries blood away from the left ventricle. The pulmonary artery carries blood away from the right ventricle. And if I poke my probe in there, you can demonstrate how it comes out the right ventricle when I put it through the pulmonary artery. And if I put it through the aorta, I'll see that it comes out the left ventricle down here. So those are the two major arteries that you're going to be responsible for on the sheep heart. The pulmonary artery in front and the aorta behind. Then if I look at the atria here, look at the right atrium, there's two major vessels that bring blood to the right atrium, and that's the superior and inferior vena cava. Now the walls of these vessels are very thin because they're veins, and veins are not muscular walled vessels. They're very thin walled, very distensible, stretchy to hold a lot of blood, carrying it back to the heart. So this is on the bottom portion, so this is the inferior vena cava, and if I look where that can poke out on the other side, I'll find the superior somewhere in here. Sometimes it's a little tricky finding that entrance and exit point. It doesn't look like we have one. It's been cut, but this is the inferior vena cava here, and it's been cut, but the superior vena cava would be here as well, but I don't see the entrance points. I think it's been cut, but I can put my probe in. If you can see both ends of the probe, you know you're in the vena cava. That's a little hint for the lab exam, because Deke often will put a probe through there. If you can see both ends, you know you're in the inferior and superior vena cava. If you can only see one side of the probe like this, then you know you're in an artery, like the aorta in the back or the pulmonary artery in the front. If he would poke it through, you would see it coming through a ventricle, not through another vessel. So you have the, again, looking at the front side, you have the pulmonary artery in front, the aorta behind, and then looking in the right atrium here, you're going to find an entrance point for that inferior vena cava coming out to the superior vena cava, like I said, which has been cut in this sheep heart. So those are the major vessels you need to know on the sheep heart. Next, we're going to make a frontal section, and I'm going to cut the heart through the atria and through the ventricles to form a frontal section, and then we're going to look at the chambers inside here. Get a better view of those ventricles. So here I've made a cross section here, and we're going to look at the back half. So I can see the ventricles here. Here's the right ventricle with my thumb here, and this is the left ventricle here. I caught more of it in my other section. There's the left ventricle in the other half. But there's the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and I see this large muscular wall that divides the two ventricles. This is the interventricular septum. It's a wall. A wall is a septum, just like the nasal septum divides your nasal cavity into the left and right nostrils. So this is the interventricular septum, and we have the right ventricle up top and the left ventricle that goes all the way down to the apex. Notice that the left ventricle, the outer wall, is much more muscular than the right ventricle. That's because the left ventricle has to pump blood to the aorta, which is a very large vessel under a great deal of pressure, and that causes that muscle to get thicker and stronger on that side. Another thing we can notice here is if I look at the top of these ventricles, I'm going to find some valves. So this is between the left atrium. This chamber here is the left atrium. This is the left ventricle. So this here with the strings attached is the left AV valve. So this is the left AV valve coming from between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And look for those strings that are attached to the left AV valve. And if I follow this left ventricle up, I can see the aorta here, this large vessel that we cut, and at the base of the aorta is a thin flap-like structure, this very thin, shiny, slippery material. This is the aortic valve. This prevents backflow of blood from the aorta back into the left ventricle. So that there is your aortic valve, that thin, flimsy tissue there. So we have the left AV valve with the strings attached and the aortic valve that does not have strings attached. So if I look at my other section, I can see the right atrium a little better. So here's the right ventricle. So here's the right ventricle. And if I look at the base of that vessel that leads from the right ventricle to the atria, I can see that this is the pulmonary artery here. But if I cut it toward the front, this is my pulmonary artery. If I take a cut and I cut it down the front here to expose the base of that artery like this. So here's the front of my heart, here's the right ventricle, and if I open up this pulmonary artery here, at its base I can also see a thin flap-like structure here, which would be the pulmonary valve. So that's at the base of the pulmonary artery, and that prevents backflow of blood into the right ventricle. So it looks just like the aortic valve. It's very thin, flap-like, but it's at the base of the pulmonary artery. And really the only way to see that is to make a little cut down the front of that pulmonary artery so you can see that valve a little more easily. So here I'll put my probe around that. There's that pulmonary valve at the base of the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle. So those are the valves, and then also if I cut here at the base of this Oh, it looks like the atrium is on this side. Nope, it's here. Let's see. The right atrium is, it looks like I cut the right atrium. It's hard to see that. I'd have to cut up into the right ventricle a little bit to catch the right AV valves. I'm just going to cut here a little deeper. But here you can see again the strings of the right AV valve at the top of the right ventricle. So here's the strings, and there's the valve right below it of the right atrium leading into the right ventricle. So you look for those strings. Only the AV valves have those chordae tendineae, or heartstrings that we call them in everyday language, that help prevent backflow of blood from the ventricles back up into the atria. So that's the right AV valve with the strings attached. And then I showed you that on the left side. This is the left AV valve here. So right AV valve, left AV valve. Remember, the left ventricle has the thicker wall, so you'll always know which side is left and right in a cross section, because look for the thicker wall. That's the left side of the heart. So this is the left AV valve. This is the aortic valve. This is the right AV valve, and then again you'd have to go on the front of the heart, cutting that pulmonary artery down to find the aortic valve down there. I can really spread it out here. You can see that pulmonary valve there at the base of the pulmonary artery. So those are the structures that you're going to be responsible for on the sheep heart. If you want to grab a half of a sheep heart to take home or to look at, just ask Deke. He'd be happy to put one in a sandwich bag for you to help you review these structures and be hands-on if necessary.